Unfortunately, because I still hold secret clearance until 2024, certain limitations are placed on me. For example, there are places in Ukraine I'm not supposed to be, and there is certain equipment I'm not supposed to touch. So, my clearance with the DoD means I can't talk about some things, and I don't have incriminating photos to show you. I have to leave out a lot of details, and many of those details are the most interesting parts of the story. For my fellow Seinfeld fans out there, it means I'm gonna have to yada yada over some of the best parts. I'm certainly not suggesting I committed any crimes, but in the few investigations I've been a part of, one thing we frequently asked was, why do criminals document their crimes? They keep digital records, they have accountants in some cases, they take pictures. In order to avoid raising any red flags, I didn't take pictures of any places or activities that were questionable. In fact, upon my return to the United States, I was debriefed, held, questioned, whatever you want to call it, by 2 officers in the Department of Homeland Security office in the airport in JFK, and I was very happy that I had no videos or photos of Ukraine on my phone at all at the time. With that out of the way, the story begins here in the United States. I had a flight leaving to go back to Ukraine shortly, within the coming weeks. I still have an apartment there in Kyiv. When I heard that the Kremlin was sending missiles into Kyiv, I got out my phone and started buying a plane ticket to Kyiv as I walked towards the exit. Before I made it out of the building, I was booked on the next flight into Kyiv. It was so early in the war, in fact, that my purchase went through. Notice that I managed to buy a flight into Kyiv. Little did I know, the airport was one of the first places that was bombed. My flight was canceled as I was driving to JFK. I sat in my car and bought a second ticket through Turkish Airlines. It was also canceled, which turns out to be a good thing because the Black Sea separates Ukraine and Turkey. I realized that if I'm left sitting in an airport, I would want it to be a different country, one that's bordering Ukraine. So I bought a flight to Poland, and I chose Poland for a number of reasons. Poland also doesn't require a visa. It's well developed. There are a few other logistical reasons that I chose Poland. Of course, I check the travel requirements of the countries I'm traveling to before I go. Also, before you board an international flight, usually the airline makes sure you have the right documents. Still, I was in for a bit of a surprise when I landed in Poland. I just went through the customs in Poland, and probably they should not have let me in because I didn't have documents. I just explained that I'm driving to Ukraine to help, and but the guy was really nice and let me through. Obstacle 1 down, moving on. Without wasting any more time, I got my bag and checked out my rental car that I had reserved while waiting to board my flight in New York, and started driving towards the Polish-Ukrainian border. No sleep, no food, no time to waste, and no idea what the speed limit was or what kilometers an hour translates to in miles. I was eager to dive headfirst into the war zone that no one knew anything about at the time. I had been to Poland before, but it was my first time seeing that much of the country. I was really taken aback by just how well maintained basically everything there is. They clearly spend a lot of money on infrastructure, and the people there were so nice it was almost strange. I'm really surprised by how nice the roads are in Poland. They're like glass, it's pretty incredible. The Polish side of the border was way less congested than I expected. There were some people from Ukraine waiting for a ride in a few smoky tents that Polish business owners had set up to cook food and give it away for free. When I tried passing into Ukraine with my rental car, customs refused me entry because I had a rental car. You need original title or registration in order to drive across the border. I began offering people rides to the places they needed to go in Poland. I drove back and forth from Ukraine to nearly the other side of Poland about 6 times within 2 days. Along the way, we paid to put people up in Airbnbs to give them some time to figure things out and come up with a more permanent solution for themselves and their families.
As you can imagine, this inadvertently led me to see even more of Poland.
During this time, the situation around Kyiv seemed to be getting much worse. Gas was pretty much non-existent in Ukraine, and there was a limit on how much you could get when you were able to find it. In Poland, there was also something of a shortage of gas, or so I was told, although I didn't actually experience that myself. Nonetheless, every time I was in Poland, I completely filled up the trunk with gasoline. Me and my friend's Nick's wife ended up going to a hardware store to buy some rubber hose in order to siphon gasoline out of abandoned cars in Ukraine, which there were a lot of, just in case things got really hairy. And they did get pretty hairy sometimes.
Okay, now we're talking. We got water, we've got gas, 95 octane, baby. Hopefully no one shoots at the back of my car.
So, yada yada yada. During this time, the situation around Kyiv seemed to be getting much worse. I had just received word that there was a convoy of Russian tanks about 11 kilometers long making its way to Kyiv. Sometime during my travels, I got word from a friend who needed a ride out of Kyiv, so I started making my way back to the border. So once again, I parked the rental car in Poland and started walking towards Lviv, where I had planned to get another vehicle. I was told of a humanitarian group looking for someone to drive an ambulance from one hospital to another in Ukraine. I agreed. This would take me to a different border than the one I had been going to. There were many more people at this border because it was the closest to Lviv. About 50 miles, if I remember correctly.
A lot of companies set up tents to give away useless things with their company logo on it. The most valuable thing I came across was a man who brought his piano to play it for people entering into Poland from Ukraine. The line of people entering into Poland was said to be 15 miles long.
The number of people walking into Ukraine? Precisely 0. Too easy, right? Not exactly.
I am the only person coming to Ukraine.
While making my way to the customs office, I was stopped by some Polish special agents dressed in plain clothes with badges hanging around a necklace. They asked if I'd come with them for a moment. Of course I agreed. They escorted me to something of a SWAT vehicle, opened up the back door, and allowed me to climb in. There were men in tactical gear lining both sides of both benches, holding their rifles between their legs with the butt of their rifle on the floor and the barrel pointed towards the ceiling. To be honest, they treated me quite well. I was never handcuffed or mistreated. There were firearms lining every inch of the inside of the vehicle, which I had immediate access to. Some of the details of that conversation I can't discuss. Basically, they were looking for someone, and I was not that someone. Still, we managed to negotiate a deal, and I'll just say that their end of the deal involved me not waiting in a line 15 miles long when returning to Poland. Nothing about the war in Ukraine scared me more than potentially waiting in a line 15 miles long to enter back into Poland. Anyway, they let me go and I made my way across the border on foot.
As you can see, in contrast, there was literally no one going into Ukraine. There's a large space in between the customs office in Poland and the one in Ukraine. After passing through both of them and walking down a long sidewalk, you come to this rickety old gate just barely wide enough to pass through. Enter Ukraine.
I met my contact at the rendezvous location and began my trip to Kyiv.
So people just drove an old car to the border and just left it?
Yeah, left the country.
The trip was a rather interesting one. I stopped for gas every chance that I could, went through a number of checkpoints. To this day, I have no idea which checkpoints were manned by Ukrainians and which ones were manned by the Russian Federation Army. I swapped SIM cards after entering into Ukraine, and to my surprise, it seemed to work in more places than I expected. Although traveling did seem rather difficult, a lot of the street lights were out. They don't exist in a lot of places in Ukraine, actually, even in normal circumstances. And even before the war, the roads were something like the surface of the moon in Ukraine. I can't imagine them being much worse now. This is day 3 without sleep, and my only objective is to reach Kyiv before the convoy of tanks. Because of Facebook, I was able to secure gas in multiple towns along the way from friends who had been displaced. They had left Kyiv and gone to stay with relatives in other villages between Lviv and Kyiv. I received multiple invitations to stay the night at people's houses. I declined them all, though I did take them up on gasoline. So gasoline proved to be less of a concern than I had anticipated, though it's certainly better to prepare for the worst. In addition to the gasoline shortage and GPS being essentially non-effective, many local governments removed the road signs in an effort to cause navigational problems for the Russian army. Now, I'm pretty late to the game on this bit of knowledge, but it was during this trip that I discovered you could download large sections of Google Maps to your phone, thanks to my friend Maria. Now, at this point, I'm in a different vehicle, still on my way to Kyiv, when I got one of the most random phone calls I'll probably ever get in my life, from a man whose name we won't mention, representing an organization that will remain anonymous, as I'm sure they don't want to be entangled with any of the specifics of my business in Ukraine. This guy and myself had a mutual friend, and he said, "Hey, I hear you're in Ukraine and you have a vehicle. Can you pick up some kids?" The situation he presented to me involved picking up 6 children in 4 separate locations across Ukraine. 2 of the children were just south of Kyiv. One of the children was clear on the other side of Ukraine, all the way towards the east. In fact, the northeastern part of Ukraine. 2 more children were between Lviv and Kyiv, and the last child was in the southwestern part of Ukraine. Now, this isn't completely accurate, but Kyiv is more or less in the center of Ukraine. That means I would either need to get these 4 children first, then go to the eastern part of Ukraine, then towards the south of Ukraine, and exit Ukraine through Moldova, or go straight to the eastern part of Ukraine, and then on my way back, get the other 5. At this point in the war, the city of Kyiv is more or less surrounded by Russian Federation Army troops. Heavy shelling and gunfighting is going on. About 72 rockets landed pretty close to my position at one point. I know it was 72 because I watched the news a few hours later, which reported 72. I put me and the 5 children's odds of survival at about 50-50.
Of course, looking back, I wouldn't have given us odds that bad, but keep in mind that at the time, no one really knew what was going on, or just how bad things would eventually get in the coming days. Add to that all the checkpoints manned by Kremlin-backed mercenaries or God knows who.
Add to that the bridges crossing the river that runs down the center of Kyiv were mostly blown in order to slow Russia's advance, my obvious navigational problems, the uncertainty of gas between Kyiv and the eastern part of Ukraine. I put the odds of all 6 of those children, plus myself, surviving closer to 0 should we drive completely across Ukraine into the eastern portion of it at that stage in the war and back.
Welcome to Ukraine, пидорасы.
We really didn't know a lot about what was going on at the time. There were no humanitarian corridors established. There wasn't even a lot of communication going on. With all that in mind, I determined that the smartest thing to do would be to get the 5 children out through Moldova and then go back for the 6th child on my own, so as not to risk the lives of all 5 children. My contact and the organization he represented agreed, and I started making my way towards the children. It was also around this time that my friends in Kiev had found their own way out. A couple of them were men, so they weren't permitted to leave the country anyway. So I was on my way to pick up the first 2 children, who were located between Kiev and Lviv. After I had got those 2 children, I was told that the kid on the eastern part of Ukraine no longer needed evacuated. He had been taken to safety. In addition to that, the 2 children located south of Kiev were waiting for passports to arrive from their home village in eastern Ukraine. How long would that take, I asked. 4 days. With that in mind, the decision was made to drive the 2 children that I had to their relatives near the border of Moldova. Along the way, we could pick up the 3rd child and take them to relatives as well. With those kids to relatives' safety in the southern part of Ukraine, the 2 children needing evacuated from the orphanage south of Kiev were transported by the government of Ukraine to Lviv. Also in Lviv was a 7th child who had parents in the United States waiting to adopt him. Perfect. Make my way to Lviv and then right over the border into Poland.
But you yada over the best part.
After passing off the children I had with me to their relatives in the southern part of Ukraine, I was clear to make my way to Lviv. The drive was full of checkpoints and navigational uncertainties. Nonetheless, I eventually made it in less than 24 hours. After arriving in Lviv, the first thing I did was made contact with the 2 children I would be taking across the border into Poland. Fortunately for me, my friend Yulia, whom I've known for over a decade, has been living in Lviv for many years now. With her help, we were able to find the first 2 children. Getting eyes on them and seeing that they were in a safe place with good people was quite a relief to us. They were staying with friends of friends who were treating them quite well. With all that out of the way, Yulia, her boyfriend, and I could start looking for the 7th child, who was in an orphanage that had been relocated from somewhere outside of Kiev to Lviv. And with very few hiccups, we were able to find the orphanage. We were able to locate the child we were there to get, but at this time we already knew we would be unable to take him with us. Go ahead.
Hello.
Yeah. Oh, now he's filming everyone.
Передавав привіт, Сань. Так, знімав.
I love you.
Before we had even arrived at the orphanage, we learned of the new law that the Ukrainian government had passed restricting any movement of orphans outside of the country of Ukraine. Reluctantly, we said our goodbyes. Even though I had spent the last several years traveling to Ukraine and even lived there for some time, this was my first time in Lviv. Knowing this, both Yulia and her boyfriend were eager to show me some locations they thought might be interesting. Even though the war had just begun and there were many uncertainties surrounding it, the people of Lviv refused to stop their lives, so most businesses were still open. We were even able to get a seat at a restaurant, which was well appreciated seeing as it was the first time I ate something that didn't come from a can for about a week. Finding accommodations during this time in Lviv was nearly impossible. People evacuating their home cities in Ukraine had either relocated to Lviv or used it as a stopgap on their way over the border. In addition to that, reporters from all around the world had just started arriving to Ukraine to cover the war and chose Lviv as their home base. This meant that there were precisely 0 Airbnbs and 0 hotels with vacancies. Still, with some luck through a friend of a friend, I was able to stay in an apartment he had up for rent. The tenants of the apartment had left when the war started, and the owner of the apartment was nice enough to let me stay there for free. While having dinner with Yulia and her boyfriend, we were discussing the logistics of how we would get all of us across the border the next day. My fear of standing in lines was no secret to Yulia. She told me of a volunteer ambulance driver friend of hers from Switzerland who was as some luck would have it, making her way back to Poland the next day. We got Yulia's ambulance driver friend on the phone, and she assured us that she would be able to drive straight to the front of the line at the border, lights flashing with no wait whatsoever. So that is exactly what we did. When we arrived at the Polish border, I called in the favor that was owed to me by the border agent in Poland. I'm again skipping some details, but the short of it is we got through both the Ukrainian's customs office and the Polish customs office in probably less than 5 minutes. A queue at the border, multiple days and 15 miles long, navigated in a matter of minutes. The whole time I was in Ukraine, I wasn't quite sure my rental car would still be in the place I left it. Much to my relief, it was. So, zipping through to the end of this story, everyone got to where they needed to be in Poland. We got them some new clothes and groceries to last a while they waited for their appointment in the embassy in Warsaw. And I headed back to Ukraine for some more adventures. A little update on our organization. We're still in the business of trying to rescue kids and currently looking into allegations of human trafficking through the country of Turkey. I've been asked if I'm taking donations. I'm not, but I can refer you to 3 organizations that are. I've worked with 2 of them. Links are also in the description below. I greatly respect your desire to seek out effective altruism.